What happens when a beloved actor sits down for what should be a friendly chat, only to face the most disrespectful host in television history in just 37 seconds? One snarky comment would destroy a career and expose the ugly truth behind Hollywood's fake smile. The studio lights were blazing hot that Tuesday evening as Mel Gibson walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel live set. The audience clapped politely, their energy subdued compared to the usual thunderous applause. Gibson had been making his rounds promoting his latest film, but this particular stop felt different. There was tension in the air that even the studio audience could sense. Jimmy Kimmel sat behind his desk with that trademark smirk plastered across his face. He had been building up to this interview all week, dropping hints during his monologue about having some tough questions ready. The producers had hyped it as must-see television, but nobody expected what was about to unfold. Gibson settled into the guest chair, adjusting his jacket and offering a genuine smile to the crowd. He had always been gracious with fans and media alike, despite years of unfair treatment from certain corners of Hollywood. Tonight, he was here to talk about his craft, his new project, and hopefully connect with viewers who had supported him through thick and thin. Kimmel started with the usual pleasantries, asking about the flight to Los Angeles and making small talk about the weather. But anyone watching closely could see the host was just going through the motions. His eyes had a calculating look, like a predator sizing up its prey. The real interview hadn't started yet. After the commercial break, things took a sharp turn. Kimmel leaned back in his chair with an exaggerated casualness that felt completely fake. He picked up his blue cards and glanced at them dramatically, as if he was about to deliver some earth-shattering revelation. "So, Mel," Kimmel began, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "I have to ask about something that's been on everyone's mind. Your comeback has been interesting to watch, but don't you think it's a little convenient that you're suddenly everywhere again?" Gibson's eyebrows raised slightly. This wasn't the typical softball question guests usually got on late-night television. "I'm not sure what you mean by convenient, Jimmy. I've been working consistently. Maybe you just weren't paying attention." The audience laughed at Gibson's quick response, but Kimmel's expression darkened. He clearly hadn't expected to be challenged so directly. Most guests would have deflected or given some corporate-approved answer about being grateful for opportunities. "Oh, I've been paying attention," Kimmel shot back, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "I'm just wondering if all this recent success has anything to do with certain political changes in the country. You know, your particular brand of, shall we say, traditional values seems to be having a moment." Gibson shifted in his seat, but his voice remained calm and measured. "Jimmy, I make movies. I tell stories. I'm not sure what politics has to do with anything we're discussing here tonight." But Kimmel wasn't finished. He leaned forward, abandoning any pretense of friendly banter. "Come on, Mel. We both know that's not entirely true. Your views are pretty well documented. I mean, some people might say you're the poster boy for a certain segment of America that feels emboldened right now." The studio audience grew uncomfortably quiet. This was supposed to be entertainment, not a political ambush. Gibson could feel the atmosphere shifting, but he maintained his composure with the professionalism that had carried him through decades in the spotlight. "I think you're trying to create controversy where none exists," Gibson replied evenly. "I'm here to talk about my work, not to be your political punching bag for the evening." Kimmel's smirk widened. He was clearly enjoying this confrontation, feeding off the discomfort he was creating. "Political punching bag? That's interesting phrasing. Almost like you see yourself as some kind of victim." Gibson's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained controlled. "I see myself as someone who came here in good faith to have a conversation about my film. If you want to have a different kind of discussion, maybe you should have been upfront about that." The host chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Good faith? That's rich coming from someone with your history. I mean, we could talk about the film, but isn't the more interesting story how you've managed to rehabilitate your image? Some might call it a masterclass in public relations." Gibson looked directly at Kimmel, his patience clearly being tested. "What exactly are you trying to accomplish here, Jimmy? Because if you have something to say to me, why don't you just say it, instead of dancing around with these passive-aggressive comments?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Kimmel had pushed his guest to the breaking point, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his confrontational approach. He was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. Kimmel's eyes lit up with malicious glee. He had been building to this moment all evening, and now he was ready to deliver what he thought would be the knockout punch. He leaned back in his chair like a king on his throne, completely convinced of his own superiority. "You want me to just say it?" Kimmel asked, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "Okay, fine. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. You've made some pretty interesting choices over the years, haven't you? Some people might say you've got a pattern of behavior that's, well, let's call it problematic. Gibson's expression hardened, but he kept his voice steady. If you have specific concerns about something I've done professionally, I'm happy to address them, but these vague accusations aren't really getting us anywhere. Kimmel practically bounced in his seat with excitement. Vague? Oh, I don't think there's anything vague about it. I mean, we could start with your creative choices. Some of your films have been pretty controversial, almost like you enjoy stirring up certain kinds of audiences. The studio audience was completely silent now. Even the cameramen seemed uncomfortable with where this conversation was heading. Gibson looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who were clearly witnessing something they hadn't signed up for. My films speak for themselves, Gibson said firmly. I make the movies I believe in, and audiences can decide whether they connect with them or not. That's how art works. But Kimmel was just getting started. He shuffled his cards dramatically and put on an exaggerated, serious expression. Art, right. Well, some people might argue that your version of art tends to have a very specific worldview, very traditional, very, shall we say, old-fashioned in its values. Gibson's patience was wearing thin, but he tried one more time to steer the conversation back to reasonable territory. Jimmy, I came here to talk about storytelling and filmmaking. If you want to have a political debate, maybe you should run for office instead of hosting a talk show. The audience chuckled at that line, clearly appreciating Gibson's attempt to diffuse the tension with humor. But their laughter only seemed to irritate Kimmel further. He was losing control of the narrative, and he didn't like it one bit. Politics, Kimmel said, his voice rising slightly. Who said anything about politics? I'm talking about basic human decency. You know, treating people with respect, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Some of us think that's pretty important. Gibson stared at him in disbelief. Are you seriously going to sit there and lecture me about treating people with respect while you've spent the last 10 minutes trying to ambush me on national television? Kimmel's face flushed red. He had not expected Gibson to turn the tables on him so effectively. Most guests would have wilted under this kind of pressure, but Gibson was fighting back with calm logic that made Kimmel look petty and unprofessional. Ambush? Kimmel sputtered. I'm asking legitimate questions that any responsible journalist would ask. The public has a right to know who they're supporting when they buy movie tickets. Gibson shook his head slowly. Responsible journalism? Is that what we're calling this? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're trying to create a viral moment at my expense. The accusation hit close to home, and Kimmel's composure finally cracked completely. His voice became sharp and angry, abandoning any pretense of professional hosting. You know what, Mel? Maybe the problem isn't me asking tough questions. Maybe the problem is that you can't handle being held accountable for who you really are. Gibson stood up slowly from his chair, his tall frame casting a shadow over the desk. His voice remained calm, but there was steel in it now. And who am I, Jimmy? Please, enlighten us all. Tell me who I really am. Kimmel realized he had gone too far, but his ego wouldn't let him back down. He was committed to this path now, even though he could see it leading nowhere good. The studio audience was completely silent, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. You're someone who thinks the world owes you something, Kimmel said, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. You're someone who can't accept that times have changed and your narrow-minded views aren't welcome anymore. You're a relic, Mel, a dinosaur trying to stay relevant in a world that's moved past you. The words hung in the air like poison. Gibson looked down at Kimmel with something approaching pity. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the silent studio. You know what's really sad, Jimmy? I came here tonight thinking we were going to have a conversation. Two professionals talking about the craft we both supposedly care about. Instead, I find out you brought me here to humiliate me for your own entertainment. Gibson paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the stunned studio. Kimmel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly realizing that he had pushed too far and was now facing a man who had nothing left to lose. But you know what the real tragedy is here? Gibson continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. You had a chance to do something meaningful tonight. You could have asked me about the craft of directing, about working with actors, about the stories I'm trying to tell. Instead, you chose to turn this into some kind of public execution for your own twisted entertainment. Kimmel tried to interrupt, his voice cracking slightly. Now wait just a minute. I think you're being a little dramatic here. Gibson held up his hand, cutting him off completely. No, Jimmy, you've had your say. Now it's my turn. His eyes swept across the silent studio audience, taking in their shocked faces. These people came here tonight expecting to be entertained, to maybe laugh a little, to forget about their troubles for a while. Instead, you've turned this into your personal therapy session. The audience members were leaning forward in their seats, completely transfixed by what they were witnessing. This wasn't the usual scripted banter they were used to seeing on late-night television. This was raw, unfiltered truth being spoken in real time. "You want to talk about accountability?" Gibson asked, his voice rising with righteous indignation. "Let's talk about your accountability. You sit behind that desk every night, making jokes about people you've never met, passing judgment on lives you know nothing about. You think that gives you some kind of moral authority?" Kimmel's face had gone pale. He kept glancing toward the producers in the wings, clearly hoping someone would step in and save him from this disaster. But nobody moved. They were all frozen, watching their host get systematically dismantled by his own guest. Gibson stepped closer to the desk, his presence filling the entire stage. "You know what I see when I look at you, Jimmy? I see a man who's so insecure about his own relevance that he has to tear down others to feel important. You're not a journalist. You're not an entertainer. You're just a bully with a television show." The words hit Kimmel like physical blows. He tried to muster some kind of response, but his usual quick wit had completely abandoned him. That's not. You can't just what?" Gibson demanded. "Can't just tell the truth? Can't just call out your behavior for what it really is? You brought me here under false pretenses, Jimmy. You lied to me, you lied to your audience, and you lied to yourself about what kind of person you are." Kimmel finally found his voice, but it came out as a desperate whine. "This is my show. You can't talk to me like this on my own show." Gibson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Your show? This isn't your show, Jimmy. This is a train wreck, and you're the conductor. You think hiding behind that desk and those writers makes you untouchable? You think you can say whatever you want without consequences?" The studio audience was completely mesmerized. Some of them had pulled out their phones and were recording, sensing that they were witnessing television history in the making. This was the moment that would be replayed endlessly, analyzed and discussed for years to come. "Here's what's going to happen," Gibson said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet tone that somehow carried more weight than any shouting. "I'm going to walk out of here with my dignity intact. You're going to sit there and think about what kind of person you've become. And tomorrow, when people ask me about this interview, I'm going to tell them exactly what happened here tonight." Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "You're making a huge mistake, Mel. Do you have any idea what kind of power I have in this industry?" Gibson stared at him, with something approaching pity. "Power? Jimmy, you don't have power. You have a platform that someone else gave you, and judging by tonight's performance, they're probably already wondering if they made the right choice." He began walking toward the stage exit, but turned back one final time. "You know what real power is? It's being able to look at yourself in the mirror every morning and feel proud of the person staring back at you. It's treating people with basic human respect, even when the cameras are rolling. It's understanding that your job is to lift people up, not tear them down for cheap laughs." Kimmel sat frozen behind his desk, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The studio audience was still completely silent, processing what they had just witnessed. Even the band seemed afraid to make any noise. "Good luck with that, Jimmy," Gibson said softly. "You're gonna need it." And with that, Mel Gibson walked off the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage for the last time, leaving behind a host whose career would never recover from 37 seconds of pure, unfiltered truth.